Okay, so the first of our speakers on the discussion panel is Fabiana Piani. Fabiana has got a lot of experience on labour market institutions and social protection policies. In 2023, she joined the Social Protection and Demography Unit of the Directorate General of the Employment, Social and Affairs and Inclusion of the European Commission, where she is in charge of ageing-related aspects of demographic change, pensions and access to social protection for non-standard forms of work. Her current focus is on demographic ageing, intergenerational fairness and modernisation. So, Fabiana, would you like to start to make some introductory comments and then we'll take it from there.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much for having me today here. It's super interesting to see how such insightful research can really help shaping policy making, which is really how necessary it is to do wise proposals indeed. And so I'm a policy maker, so you will have a shock now because there are no models and nothing, absolutely, no data, no figures. And I'm going to maybe try to put together something what is our approach which could be relevant for the discussion of today. First element is that for several years already, I'll say at least from the beginning of 2000, the Commission has taken a so-called social investment approach to social policy making, which comes from Anton Emmerich analysis, studies in the beginning of 2000 already. The idea that spending in social welfare state and social protection and these kind of elements is a contribution to the economic growth, so as an economic added value. And this is really the fil rouge of the action, and maybe it's maybe a necessity for the Commission to try out a way to make member states spend on social and justify this direction as compared to the budgetary constraints, which are very much in the previous decade, actually until 2010 and 11. So this is a key element. In this framework, social investment means focusing on opportunities. Opportunities with a life cycle approach. Someone was not really, here the focus today is very much on education, of course, as a main enabler. But the approach of the Commission is indeed that the idea that you have to spend to allow people to have equal opportunities and allow them throughout the life cycle. Because this kind of investment brings economic returns according to the paradigm used by the Commission. This is clear in the most recent Compass for Action of the EU, which is the European Pillar of Social Rights, which was adopted with the Juncker Commission after the crisis. And there, these 20 principles which are in the pillar, which go over the 3 phases of pre-market, market, post-market, actually, are all about enabling people, opportunities, and institutions. There are about 20 rights, social rights, but it's about people must have access to adequate social protection or must have access to fair jobs. So this is the idea that people must be able to act. In this sense, this can be relevant for what we call that intergenerational persistence or inequality, because this should be enabling, this should be an environment enabling people to get out of the situation of poverty. I would like to talk maybe about 2 forthcoming initiatives that we have in the pipeline, which could be relevant for this debate. One is the first ever EU anti-poverty strategy, which will be out in the first semester of next year. The anti-poverty strategy, the idea will be to help break the intergenerational transmission of poverty in the EU. So the focus on the policy action which will propose member states is about the future generations, actually, how to help the next people, the children of today's poor, so instead of corrective action, preventive action. What we like to do is a holistic approach, family-based policies, and a focus on ensuring opportunities for the younger generations, once again. So this is again a social investment approach. The idea is going to have a policy proposal, a person-centered approach, so develop concrete solutions for people, to do it throughout the life cycle again, a systemic approach, so a whole of government approach, a much importance of local dimension. Territorial dimension is key. And maybe the evidence on the geographical mobility could be supportive of this, that how much all the infrastructure, not only infrastructure, but also social infrastructure and services are relevant for supporting children out of poverty, for instance. The first element that we look into this strategy is going to be childhood, so access for children to early child education and care. We have already a child guarantee, European Child Guarantee, which was adopted in 2021. This is the masterpiece until now for fighting intergenerational transmission of poverty for us. And this will be reinforced the next year in the framework of the poverty strategy. The guarantee asks member states to ensure access to quality child education and care, food, healthy food, housing, so this kind of these services. Member states are working towards that, and we are going to support it again. Second element, of course, is education. Now, we have some actions education, but we have already adopted in March 25 a new encompassing proposal, which is, action, which is a union of skills, which goes from basic skills until vet and portability of skills. The issues that we see that education is the design education is key for ensuring the people out of poverty, or enabling people to thrive in life and society and economy. Most often education is also a factor of barrier, of not allow obstacles to, in fact, to progression in the way it is designed, or the importance to give to education itself, the quality of teaching, and also other elements in the design of education system which can support the avoid intergenerational transmission of poverty, like mentoring schemes and so on. So this element will be all part of the approach. Of course, what you see as very important is the participation of parents in the education of children. So this is what parenting is super important, but also the environment, larger environment. So places outside school which support children. School itself is not enough. It has to be a securing environment which can support the mindset, the growth or positive mindset of children, because these give trust. So the psychological element is key, the idea that you can trust, you can believe in the future. So this is an element to add, I'll say, to the consideration, the policy design as well, because this is key. Another element, of course, we didn't talk about this very much today, is a transition to education to work is super important for youth, and also therefore the issue of need, so those who need an employment, education, and training, and that this is really super important. Education is important, but then how to help this transition. This is really somewhere which really deserves attention, which is we do already in action will be strengthened. And of course, again, the key in all this, and also this is very much relevant in all the actions we are doing, the demography toolbox we did in 23 and so on, the local dimension. The territorial dimension is a key element. We study a lot the regions in development trap. So where you have the issue of aging, population, depopulation, no access to services. So those who are there, whatever you can do in one element, are trapped. So this is so important to find this systemic approach at local level, is to invest the energies in the geographical concentration way. Another element which we are going to already working on in the framework of this strategy is the issue of informal economies, black economy, because those in poor city status are most often at risk of being trapped in informal economy. So we are working to support the emergence and regularization of informal employment. It is also an element because it's a parenthood, which parents can afford having supporting better children if the regular employment and then access to social protection and other elements. Another, just going very fast now, another element is important in social protection systems is the design also of administrative procedures, the issue of non-take-up. So minimum income and other schemes matter as well because you support parenting also for children, but often there's the issue of not taking up such benefits. So the design, administrative procedures, the simplification, and the assistance, physical assistance is super important. We do other actions. We have the EU Affordable Action Plan, which is going to be out in December this year. So it's an element, but it's not enough to support children out of poverty. And we have also a social economy action plan. And there we see the importance of supporting the social economy as a way to enter into the economy for those in need, and also macrofinancing and so on. And this is a work in progress. So these are different elements on our intergenerational fight against poverty. And the other element I want to bring to your attention, and this is very fast, is about another big strategy which is going to be put forward in this commission, with this strategy on intergenerational fairness. So the link maybe is not clear with the issue of intergenerational equality, but it's there because this is across the board. So the future generation will be worse off the current generation. So how do those who are really worse off will do in the future if you're in a situation of impoverishment of the young people across the board? You see in the housing problem, you see the issue of social mobility, which is much more now linked to inheritance. I mean, there's a problem of access to young and opportunities in the economy, in the labor market, which is higher in the baby boomers generation, for instance. So this strategy, if it's completely to be decided yet, will be out in the first semester next year. We'll try to put the idea of long-term policy making and thinking for future generations in the policy making across the board. We are working on indicators, monitoring frameworks, and developing indexes to be able to assess how the generations today perform, how in 20 years will perform, to address policy making for the future. So this is a work which is being run by colleagues that try to use international indexes. There are many indexes on well-being and so on, and try to develop a framework for action in the future, also to have an impact assessment of our action, and to have a net of member states in this respect. So this is what we are going here. It's really very little, so we look forward for your contribution on the research agenda. It's very important. Thank you.
That was great. Thanks very much. I mean, I think that's already enough material to generate a great deal of discussion, but before we can go on to that, let's get the view from the OECD. So we're very lucky. We've got Sebastian Konings from the OECD here. He's a senior economist with the OECD Jobs and Income Division. He's also a research fellow at the IZA Institute for the Study of Labour. He works on various topics on the labour market and social protection, with particular focus on inequalities, social mobility. He's got a PhD from Oxford, and before he joined the OECD, he was a teaching associate at the University of Oxford, and also a consultant at the World Bank. So, Sebastian, thanks very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and yeah, it's really been a fascinating day today. So it's been a huge pleasure following some of these debates. I think it's fair to say that the topic of social mobility has been a priority topic for the OECD for a long time, and I'm very grateful for Herman for putting some of the early references on the slide. So I went back to our digital archive to kind of get an idea of when we started working on it. And I think it was in 2008 when we wrote the first chapter on intergenerational social mobility as part of the flagship report on growing unequal back then. Back then, that was before my time. I was doing an internship with the OECD at that point in time, so I do remember. Back then, there wasn't original research we did. It was more pulling together different types of indicators from people like Miles Korog and Marcus Ienti, who were working already back then on this topic. But then there was the paper by Orsetta Krause and Åsa Johansson that you referred to in 2009, which used Silk data and PISA data, and which I think was the first original OECD contribution, also with the PISA data. Both of them are still at the OECD. Åsa Johansson is now a deputy director, so that shows, I think, that working on social mobility can help you climb the ladder. So also internal social mobility. And I think we managed I'd like to believe, to really put the topic into the public discourse through the Broken Social Elevator report that we published in 2018, where we pulled together a lot of research and produced a lot of own research, both on social mobility over people's lives and between generations. And one little anecdote I'd like to say is that in the Paris metro for a while, there were posters hanging from a French NGO, the Secours Populaire, that were advertising their anti-poverty campaigns, referring to some of the statistics that we had produced in a Broken Social Elevator. And so I think that's kind of maybe one dimension of achievement, or one measure of achievement that we managed to contribute to pushing this topic into the public debate. There's today an OECD Observatory on Social Mobility and Equal Opportunity that particularly the colleagues in the OECD WISE Center are working on, and it's also under this observatory that this recent publication on inequality of opportunities that Herman also kindly referred to was published a couple of weeks ago, I should say, sorry. So this is work that looks a bit further than just at intergenerational social mobility, at inequality of opportunities more broadly. So there is certainly the element in there of the transmission from parents to children, but there are also broader individual and household circumstances, including migrant status or sex or the region where I grew up, or kind of the household circumstances at a young age. And so this report was led by the colleagues in the WISE Center. We contributed a chapter on geographic inequalities of accessibility to services in it. And this is kind of trying to push this agenda forward. At this point, I should say a very warm thank you to the European Commission and DG Employment, because they've been funding a lot of this work that's been coming out of the OECD on inequalities and social mobility for years. So we've really had an excellent collaboration, and also moving forward, DG Employment is an important partner for us in this work. I think generally speaking, the role of the OECD in social mobility work, I hope, is twofold. I'm here to talk about policy, I know, but I'd like to talk about data first, because this is kind of our bread and butter as well. And thanks again to Herman for kind of advocating the usefulness of cross-country research, because I think this is partly our role, is to make sure that there are data out there that we can use to measure social mobility, the impact of policies, but also just to quantify social mobility across generations and over the life course across countries. I mentioned the PISA data before, that were kind of a very early source of OECD-produced microdata that were used to study social mobility. More recently, there's the OECD survey of adult skills under the PIAC program. They just released, the colleagues who are working on this, released a second wave of this, covering 29 countries. And this PIAC survey, so the main purpose of the survey is to measure the development over time of adults' competencies. So basic skills and kind of the jobs that adults do in the labor market, the different tasks they have. But this survey also includes some information on parental background, notably on parental education, because that's easier to measure. And there's some ongoing work in using PIAC to assess intergenerational social mobility from this educational perspective. So that's again Rosetta Kauser, who works at our economics department, who's been doing this. The work was just presented internally, so it's not public yet, but it should be out relatively soon. Another initiative that I'd like to talk about, because it comes out of our directorate, is that we're trying to push ahead again with the support of the European Commission, the use of administrative data in studying inequalities more broadly and kind of labor market mobility, but social mobility specifically. One of the big projects that I should mention here is on linked employer-employee data, and we saw like a fantastic application by Per today of kind of the richness of the data. It's actually the first time that I saw them being used for studying intergenerational social mobility. But we have this project called Linked 2.0, where we're building a network, or we've developed a network with the kind support from Shell, or the implication, for studying people's job mobility over people's lives, to measure productivity, to measure the reallocation of jobs, job-to-job changes. So kind of closely related to the topic that you've been talking about and the question that I asked. Within my team, we've started trying to develop a similar infrastructure looking at income taxes. This is much more complicated because these data are much less readily available at the moment and they're much less harmonized. There's also a huge issue about tax systems being very different in different countries, so constructing households to be able to measure something like household disposable income is very complicated. Not all income sources are covered, but our idea is that we'd like to develop a similar structure where we can carry out cross-country research on income inequalities and then income ability, mainly probably over the life course initially, just because of short observation periods for a larger number of countries. And this is something that we started a year or two ago. This has been growing and we're very excited about it, and we're hoping that we can contribute in making administrative data usable for cross-country research on social mobility. So that's the data side. Now on the more policy side, yeah, the publications I've mentioned are kind of contributions by the OECD to push ahead the discourse on social mobility. I mean, in a first instance, to provide evidence, but then also to help kind of bridge the gap between academia and policymakers and the public, and to kind of help shape a useful narrative about social mobility. I think if we're talking about the question what works and what doesn't work, I think to be maybe slightly provocative, I don't think the problem at this point is anymore that there's a shortage about what works. So I think certainly when we're talking about stopping the transmission of disadvantage from parents to their children, there's an awful lot that we know already. We know about the importance of very early interventions in the perinatal period, about nutrition programs, about programs of combating child poverty. There's a ton of evidence out there for quite a while on the positive impact that early childhood education and care systems have, particularly for the disadvantaged, and also in some countries at least how low childcare participation rates are still for households on lower incomes. Then you mentioned the situation of young people. We know what works for disadvantaged young people, because this is kind of work that we've been doing for 10 years, for 15 years, about the need to support disadvantaged kids in school, the need to channel more finances into disadvantaged schools or schools in disadvantaged neighborhoods, the importance of mentoring programs, and then the school-to-work transition, the usefulness of VT. So all of these are policies that have been evaluated for many, many years. They're documented in the Broken Social Elevator report that I mentioned earlier, so that was in 2018. Certainly there's been development since, but I don't think the problem is so much a shortage of kind of knowledge on what works. I think the question is rather that it's very difficult and very costly to implement some of these policies. And I think what we're seeing is that there has been progress made along some of these dimensions, and I think ECEC participation rates, for instance, are one example where also with the help of the European Commission, I think the countries where ECEC participation is very low. I mean, some of the OECD accession countries, I've done some work on Bulgaria, Romania, and Croatia, for instance, where ECEC participation is very low for cultural reasons, for institutional reasons. And I think there is a push in increasing this, and this is going to have an effect on social mobility. If we're talking about the NEET challenge, so young people not in employment, education, or training, NEET rates have massively declined over the last 10 years. It's actually in my previous life at the OECD, this is what I worked on. That was like when I joined in 2013, that was at the peak of the youth unemployment crisis. And we wrote reports about the need to bring these NEET rates down. And if we're looking at the rates today, they're much, much better. I mean, thanks to broader circumstances, but also thanks to policy interventions. I think the challenge that we're facing today, so it's not so much a question of a lack of evidence what to do, but rather how do we create a positive or the right political discourse about making these things happen. And so if maybe things haven't been moving so much in terms of the evidence, I think what's been changing a lot over the last years is kind of the political environment in which we're operating and having some of these conversations. And the first point is obviously the massive rising pressure that we're seeing on government budgets, which means that certain types of interventions that we know have a positive rate of return, but have a positive rate of return not tomorrow in 3 or 4 years, but maybe in 10 years or 15 years down the line, they're being deprioritized. And there's a lot of thinking about how can we make social spending more efficient, more effective. And you alluded to some of these initiatives. So this is part of the discussion that we're having with member states, thinking more about the efficiency and effectiveness of public spending, thinking more about targeting, obviously thinking more about kind of the work incentive effects, the role of digitalization. The second point is, at least for an organization like the OECD, we're consensus-based. That means that the work that we're putting out essentially needs to be approved by all member states, and the geopolitical landscape has just been changing a lot. And it's fairly obvious that a discourse today about inclusiveness and about inequalities and maybe even about redistribution is much more difficult to be had across all OECD countries than it was the case 5 years ago. So we're thinking a lot about how we can reframe some of the questions that we're studying on to make them appealing to all member countries. I think when working on inequalities, this is challenging because it's just fairly obvious that there are certain important member countries now where addressing inequalities is not kind of a top priority concern at the moment, and we're just having this discourse. There isn't a lot of resonance. My impression is that that might create an opportunity to talk a bit more about social mobility, because social mobility is a topic that to some extent has an appeal on both sides of the political spectrum. So there's clearly an inclusiveness and equity argument to be had for why we need social mobility. And I don't need to convince you of that. But on the other hand, it's also very easy to make maybe more a growth argument or an efficiency argument about social mobility, about the need to help everyone kind of exploit their potential, because we're very much now having a discourse about, okay, where should our productivity growth come from? Where does our innovation come from? We discussed earlier that we just published an employment outlook which was focused on demographic change and aging workforce. And part of the conversation to be had is, how do we bring as many people as we can into the labor market in a context where the workforce is shrinking? So we need to upskill, and we need to make sure not only that women participate and not only that older workers participate, but also that disadvantaged young people can kind of climb the ladder and make it into the labor market, because we just need their resources. So in that sense, I think there's a possibility of pushing forward the social mobility agenda also just from a purely, well, efficiency, growth, productivity, labor force participation angle, which I think we should see as an opportunity. And then finally, I've been working a bit more on kind of life course social mobility than intergenerational social mobility. And I think there the perspective of shock resilience, societal shock resilience and individual shock resilience is something that's much higher now on the policy agenda than it was certainly pre-COVID. And so some of the data that we're collecting and some of the analysis that we're doing, I think, can be framed very nicely in terms of shock resilience, and then have a relevance in the policy debate that is maybe different than if we only phrase it in terms of inclusivity. So I think that's like my initial thoughts. I was going to have some conclusion, but I think it's very difficult to conclude.
Let's keep the conclusions to the conclusion.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe the conclusion is it's a very fascinating time, I think, to be working on these issues, both on the data side and on the policy side. And I'm very much looking forward to engaging with you on this.
All right. Look, when time's flying by, right? So we still have the opportunity to listen to Vincenzo. So, but I will say that once Vincenzo finishes, and he should finish when he feels appropriate, not to feel they rushed in any way, we'll throw it open for discussion. I mean, I think it's a great opportunity for people who are so heavily engaged in this kind of research to have the opportunity to exchange people who are actually involved in making the policies which we're all trying to study and develop. So I invite you all to start thinking of your questions now. As I said, we've not had the benefit of listening to Vincenzo Di Mauro, who's from the World Bank. I'm sure the World Bank has the same views as the OECD and European Commission. So he serves as a senior economist in poverty and equity global practice for the Latin American and Caribbean region. where he has a background in research and analytics dedicated to advancing research-based policy making with applications to conditional cash transfers, consumption patterns, poverty alleviation, early childhood development, and the strengthening of public sector governance. He's currently co-leading a global program focused on policy-relevant research on inequality. In addition to his work at the World Bank, he has a background in publishing papers, and we have the benefit of listening to his thoughts on the issue. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity to participate to the workshop. Thanks for your kind introduction, and thanks to all the presenters for the result you shared. Yeah, you will hear in a moment that I think with the Commission, with the OECD, we share at the broad level very much the same policy recommendation. So I will try actually to reshape a bit what I wanted to discuss, trying to offer some of the recommendations that you did not mention, but yeah, by and large, something significantly new will be said. But anyway, of course, as you probably know, inequality and mobility has been a topic that the bank has done from day zero, if we want. Especially on the analytical side, the amount of work, which I'm sure most of it you already know, was produced or sponsored by the World Bank. I will touch in a moment on this analytical work, but let me start trying to discuss those results that are in a way more policy relevant, as you expect, and let me start from some key recent development. So basically, for the first time, the World Bank has adopted what we call a corporate scorecard indicator that tracks countries on inequality. So basically now countries are, let's say, flagged if they have a Gini above 40. So this sounds, in a way, there is all a technical paper that explains why we chose 40. But regardless of that, the main idea and the policy relevance of it means that now there is a list of countries, especially in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, that are flagged as high inequality countries. So those countries can come to the World Bank and ask assistance to directly address inequality. So this is, for the bank, I would say, a strategic shift. And as I'm arguing, that can bring really to something that is very much policy relevance. At the same time, I should mention that we also adopted a measure of shared prosperity that is called the Global Prosperity Gap, though you can also calculate the prosperity gap in each country, which is a measure, we can go in the QA into the details, that gives even more weight to people that are at the bottom of the welfare distribution compared to the previous shared prosperity measure we used. Going back to the scorecard indicator, just to give you an example, in 2024, we had 44 countries that were flagged as high inequality. So this is, a sizable number. As Frank kindly already mentioned, within this new context of focusing on inequality, with some important caveats that I think you can read in the news, let me mention that I'm co-leading a global program on inequality, which has the objective of doing two things. The first thing is to kind of taking stock through papers that summarize the leading evidence, the frontier knowledge on inequality. And so we have papers on income and consumption inequality, of course, but then we have an important paper on wealth inequality, which, as you know, you know very well, is not as studied as income or consumption. And then we have a paper I want to mention in a moment on political economic consequences of inequality, which is actually authored by Pranab Bardhan, who, actually the draft is ready, but these papers are not available yet, soon. They will be published in a special issue of a journal. But actually, Pranab Bardhan is writing a paper trying to argue that the trade-off between equity and efficiency, which was mentioned by Ludwig before as well, does not really exist in practice. So it will be a very nice paper on making that point. Then let me also quickly say that in terms of other work, which is more historical, if you want, let me mention that, our very first chief economist Holly Chenery published a book when he was chief economist of the bank in 1979, which was called Redistribution with Growth. So really the interest dates back quite a lot. And you might have seen many World Development Reports on the topic of inequality. There is always some component on the WDR, World Development Reports, that treats inequality. Then I will finish this initial remark by making an attempt to answer the policy question. Though, as I said, probably I will not say anything dramatically new. But let me try to discuss basically what should countries do to reduce inequality and enhance mobility. Or I should say, to be honest, basically to just switch to a more inclusive development path, which can be achieved through the focus on inequality and mobility, but also in some other ways. So our 2024 Poverty, Prosperity, Planet report, which is basically the World Bank flagship report on poverty and inequality, or shared prosperity more generally, I think offers a policy framework that is very interesting because gives policy recommendation based on the level of economic development of countries, and that's probably not new, but also ties that with the level of the emissions they produce. So they try to, have a broad framework that still consider climate change into the equation. And as you know better than me, because the point here is that not only countries that on average emit the least emissions, the poorest country, are typically those that bear the highest cost. And this is true at country level, but it's also true within countries where poorer people are typically more exposed to climate change shock or natural shocks more generally. So basically, the three recommendations that they have is that for low-income countries, as I said, typically low emissions producers, they should still focus on reducing, on making investments. That's an important word. I hope I have time later to make a point, to prioritize poverty reduction. So not necessarily focusing on inequality per se. Middle-income countries should pursue kind of two goals at the same time, that is income growth, but also reduce vulnerability. And they make an example, which I think is very relevant for many countries, of reducing air pollution, for example. And then finally, high-income countries, which are typically high-emission producers, should put their efforts on accelerate the transition and the mitigation efforts, and manage the transition cost, especially for people that are more poor and vulnerable. So I stop here with the promise that I can make another point later.
No,
Thanks.
Okay, so why don't we take some questions from the audience, and maybe we'll take a couple of questions at once, and then the three policy participants can allocate the questions across themselves.
Thank you. I have a question for Fabiana. You mentioned the social investment approach, and one of the Anton Hemerijk is here, one of my colleagues here at the department. So we it's a topic that comes across quite a bit. One of the debates in this field is that some critics of the social investment approach say that it leads to Matthew effects. So if we invest in skills, it's the ones that are, let's say, coming from more advantaged backgrounds who benefit from those investments. So in fact, if you focus on skill provision as the main channel of policy, you would increase, in fact, inequalities more than, let's say, more traditional welfare state kinds of provisions. This might be particularly true when you think about childcare or, parts of the skill provision distribution where, in fact, people have a choice. Families have a choice whether to bring the child to childcare or not. So if a society invests a lot in childcare, it might lead to those Matthew effects because it's the children of working parents who go to childcare and benefit from it. However, there's also a whole fraction of the educational distribution where everybody goes to compulsory education. Namely, so wouldn't the social investment approach be better targeted to skill provision in schools, optimizing the quality of education, rather than promoting childcare or these kinds of more choice-driven skill provisions. And I was just wondering how the European Commission looks at that.
Yeah, I think it is the idea of the social investment approach is really life cycle approach. So it's not only about education, it's about all social policies across the board. It is exactly the idea that social policies is an investment. It is maybe an escamotage, because as you're already listening, the issue is that is the budgetary constraints. So how to make pass the idea that social is necessary, it contributes to growth. So that's the problem. If you, so the issue of education and childcare, yes. Then it is in the design. But I think the social investment approach goes beyond the specific issue of education design and what we push for in the specific element. And we have a really big debate about that in 2024, where the Belgian presidency of the Union, the Spanish presidency, they tried very much to push for social investment to be part in the, because you have a budgetary budget constraints in the Union with the growth, stability and growth pact in European level, but you have to keep the debt and deficit level in European. So we want to make sure that all what is social, not only education and childcare, can be exempted from calculation of debt. And we are working on that to make sure we can invest. That's really the really terrible trade-off we have. Now, yeah, it's clear. Then you have to, it also depends very much on member states how to decide to push forward. The recommendations on the policy design are quite vague at European level. We don't have that competence to go such inside. It is true that in education and childcare it is easier to demonstrate the economic return than other policies. That's the problem. If you go into social protection expenditure, I am social protection expenditure unit and long-term care. We try to put it inside in all possible ways, but they come back. We have to really demonstrate that there is added value in terms of economic return. We are really trapped into this. So yes, fully take your point. You are right. There's a risk of increasing inequality. That is in design. The issue is, but you have to find a way to demonstrate that this applies to all what is social. So that the equity and efficiency is not a trade-off, but it is together. Don't know if I replied, maybe not.
Sorry.
It's all right. I just wanted to make a follow-up comment on that. There was this fantastic presentation by Hilary Hoynes at the LSE 2 weeks ago. I don't know if anybody heard about it. And actually she was using exactly this approach to talk about cash transfers in the US. And I think it's videoed, so you may want to have a watch of that, because she was making it a much broader argument, and I think maybe you'd appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you all three for a very fascinating discussion. It's great to hear that there is still resonance for these topics within your respective institutions, and it's also great to hear about all the great work that you're doing and get a reminder of all the great work you have been doing over the past several decades. So this is very uplifting. But then when I hear the specific policies that are being mentioned, a lot of it seems focused on education, right? And if we look at the trends in education, especially higher education within the last 1 or 2 decades across a wide range of rich Western countries, university expansion seems to have leveled off. The returns to education seems to have stalled or actually declined in several countries that I'm aware of. So I just wonder, and then Fabiana, you mentioned the need to think about what policies are effective in the future and not just today or in the recent past. So I was just wondering how you think about the equalizing power of education within that context. I mean, any one of you should feel free to answer, but perhaps I throw it back to Sebastian.
Yeah, thank you, Per. And let me maybe start and let the other colleagues jump in. I think I need to structure my thoughts, but I think so I'm working on labor market and social protection, not on education policies as such. So I think where we are interested in education is to the extent that it allows people to get the skills to be successful in the labor market. So we have a lot of focus on VET programs. I think there might have been a trend, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, away from VET towards trying to bring as many people as possible into tertiary education, but this is not something that we would favor anymore. And so in the work that we've done, we've been doing on disadvantaged youth, for instance, kind of VET programs, apprenticeships programs play a huge role, and we know that these programs work particularly well for more disadvantaged students or for students who are less interested in tertiary education. More broadly speaking, I think a lot of the discourse that we're having on more inclusive labor markets, on job quality, on ALMPs, are in the end, those are topics that also speak to a social mobility perspective. I think maybe the reason why I didn't mention them is a bit the point that Herman mentioned, that we have a lot less evidence that they have direct effects on social mobility. I think it's harder to measure. Certainly then for ECEC or programs to support disadvantaged youth. But I think there's a lot of work happening there, I don't know, improving social protection for non-standard workers, for instance. And these are things that benefit disadvantaged populations, that probably are good for intergenerational social mobility, and then for life course social mobility. And it's just, I think the evidence on this is less stark, but that doesn't mean that we don't care for them, right? From an inclusiveness point of view, but also just, again, from a productivity point of view, and because it's important to bring people into the labor market. I don't know if that really responds to your question.
Yeah, that's exactly what I want to hear. So what I'm hearing is that probably the rest of us in this room should be doing more work to provide evidence on exactly those sorts of policies, which is what I intend to do. So I'm of course very happy to hear. Thank you.
This is exactly perfect, and with the intergenerational fairness perspective, which is futuristic. The issue is that now with the demographic change, people live much longer, so the issue of this healthy and active aging, which can be in the labor market or not. And then the idea that, okay, because the demographic change is a different issue, how to solve it? Some people and some countries say you need higher fertility, but this is a free choice. I mean, you can support those who want to have reach what the desired level of children or not, or migration, of course, is an element, working longer, of course. So how to, instead of trying to push more people to have more people inside, which is an element, also how to redesign our policies fit for these demographic realities. So we cannot necessarily have to change demographic realities, but to make our society economy fit for that. And the idea is that how to rethink education systems. For instance, so because maybe what we are today is not anymore good for this social mobility because it was fit for the past. For instance, the idea that you can have the possibility in social protection system to stop working for 1 year when you are 50 and go back to education without having a hole in your progression. So rethinking the way education, our skills are conceived. So this is really important to make it possible for people to go on later also young, to have the skills which are needed now, which can be different. There are sectors like a long-term care sector, which is incredible labor shortages. We have huge labor shortages in the EU, and the education system doesn't fit. So long-term care is a sector with very low pay conditions, with segregation of women, migrants with impossible conditions, no access to pensions practically, impossible working conditions. Maybe we should reward these sectors, professionalize them, and pay them better because they're essential for the society, as we saw during the COVID crisis. So rethinking the way we price or we pay the work, and then fit the education to that. It was also appealing to train for that job. So it was not very clear, but that's really interesting to think forward, maybe. Adult learning, of course, so really to rethink all the system in a way which is fit for this future.
To close the circle, but very quickly so that we can hear more questions. But, for poorer countries, of course, the issue, the access is still there, but not all. I mean, for example, ILAC is not the case at this point, but certainly the gradient in tertiary education is huge in most countries yet. And then I will also put on the table, was already mentioned, the issue of quality, meaning the expansion is very successful in most countries, but the quality can be very, very different across, for example, places, income quintiles, for example.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing these very thoughtful reflections on our solutions of rising inequality and our changing mobility. So during the whole day of discussions, I was expecting to hear some discussions related to AI-driven inequality and changing mobility, but somehow I feel like this is a topic that is lacking in our discussion today, so I decided to bring it up. So there is just a growing number of sociologists and economists who work on the future of work, how the restructuring of jobs, the growing number of new jobs or disappearing of some of the traditional jobs will change the type of inequality we observe. So many assume this will have a bigger impact on the high-skill laborers and the low-skill laborers. As Elon Musk, I read his Twitter, so he was saying that the electricians, carpenters, plumbers will be the last job we will observe for human beings. So there is a lot of work from the academic side, but I just want to hear your thoughts from the policy side if there is some ongoing initiatives or discussions. So probably this can open up just some more discussions among us too.
I was trying to look, I don't remember. So, yes, I have it. So, yeah, I mean, in terms of looking at the issue in Latin American and Caribbean countries, I'm looking at the working paper that was just published by a colleague of mine at the World Bank, together with the ILO, with the researcher at the ILO, on kind of distribution implications of generative AI. So that's certainly an example I can share. And the issue is very present in discussions. I cannot refer yet to a full report, a seminar report that systematizes the issue, but certainly not something we are ignoring.
Okay, this is a bit outside of my comfort zone because I haven't worked on the topic, but so we're certainly working on this, and in fact we had an employment outlook, I think 2 years ago, that was on AI and the labor market. I think the problem that we're having is just that things are moving so fast that an employment outlook from 2 years ago, I mean, I don't want to go on record, I'm on record here, right, saying it's not particularly relevant anymore, but it's like these things are moving extremely fast, right? And so the OECD did a ton of work on kind of the potential impact of digitalization and automation on the labor market, I don't know, 10 years ago. And I think some of the predictions are now proving quite off, right? Because the predictions were like routine tasks would easily be replaced, while tasks requiring a lot of creativity would be very difficult to replace. And what we're seeing now is that, to some extent, especially the tasks that require a lot of productivity, a lot of creativity, are being replaced now. I think one of the outcomes from the work that we did 2 years ago is that our forecast then, or our assessment was that it's unlikely that it would lead to massive employment losses in the short run, but it would lead to transformation. So there's certainly an implication for just skills policy, and I briefly whispered adult learning because this is an area where we're doing a ton of work. Again, something that I think from a social mobility perspective is extremely important. It's one area where I think a lot more work needs to happen across OECD countries, across EU countries. Adult learning rates are extremely low, and the people who participate are the high-skilled people, so probably the people from well-off backgrounds. And we're not bringing the people who need the adult learning the most into these systems, or if we bring them into the systems, it's maybe not the type of programs that are very productive or that are of high quality, and so I think in a way, there are still low-hanging fruits there. And I think part of the response to AI is we need to get much, much better at training people all the time, essentially, right? When you said education, I mean, the idea is always kind of the education that's front-loaded. Maybe that starts at ECEC, but it goes to tertiary education, and then you're in the labor market. And I think we really need to completely change our perceptions of what education means. There needs to be a lot more on-the-job training. There needs to be very effective training of people when they're unemployed. But it's just, we need to change the mindset and make sure that people constantly continue learning. And certainly if AI is progressing this fast. We haven't done any work on AI and inequality specifically. We've been receiving kind of nudges that we should go in that direction and start thinking about this. It's just extremely complicated, right? I mean, it's complicated from a technical point of view, thinking about, okay, how would you do that? I think the PIAC data that I mentioned earlier can be quite useful because they provide very precise information on not just educational background, but what people do in their jobs and what capacities they have. And so this helps, but precisely because things are moving so fast. I mean, OECD research projects usually last a minimum of a year. And it feels at the moment, if you start working on something like this in a year's time, by the time the report is ready, you feel you need to kind of change some of your premises. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't work on it. And policymakers certainly should think about it, but it's just very challenging to work on something that's so fast moving, I think.
Yeah, I think the reality is that they won't have any choice, right?
Yeah.
I think they're seeing it's going to be just overwhelming at the issues that are coming up. So look, our time is up, but I mean, do we have time for one last question?
The point you still wanted to make?
Of an outstanding quality? Oh, we've got two now. We've got two questions of outstanding quality. Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is outstanding quality, but if I think again, policies on mindset, which you mentioned, mindset, growth mindset. So something that I'm concerned about in general about social policies that target children is that it seems like we are more and more going into a paternalistic approach, that the government institutions know it better than the parents do. And how can we tackle that? How we can implement policies such that in the end of the day, the parents' job to educate and raise the children, and the government doesn't take too much over the role.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to the issue of lifelong learning that you brought up, and I'm very glad you mentioned it because I do think it's important. But it does feel like a catchphrase that was more en vogue 10, 15 years ago. Am I right? Or is that just, like as a kind of casual outsider, that is my impression, that it was like kind of very hot in the past, and I don't hear it that much in the policy debate right now, but maybe it was always there and I wasn't paying attention. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, then that's just my ignorance. Great.
That's a very difficult question. Well, I will start saying that being Italian, for us, paternalistic is positive. So that's, that's the answer. But more seriously, more seriously, I don't know, the only thing, it's not a policy of the World Bank, but one thought one could argue is that when the differences between, say, lowest income quintile and highest become so big, sometimes not captured by the Gini, then one could start to think that, it becomes really difficult for super low income, super low education parents to make the right choices. But this could be paternalistic. I totally agree with you. But I think maybe, at some point the government is there, should have a vision, that's the point I want to make, should have a vision to embrace those difficult questions without imposing things, but also without shying away to address the problem. That's maybe the answer. An answer.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, just in this. In fact, I think in our approach anti-poverty strategy, if it's going to be, is that you have to support the children, but the family as well, in the sense to give them the means, because it's the way to enable them. So this is really important. So fighting in work poverty, which is also work intensity, but also having the parents are partner and involved in the decisions. So a whole family supporting approach is not about only children. Otherwise, it's just a little piece, it risks being effective. So it is part of it. And also, for instance, allowing them having care services is important for children, but also for the mother who can work. Because so this is short-term return over the education and training for the mothers, which are able to get into the labor market and be able to contribute in a different way from all point of view to the growing up of the child. So this is short-term. And then long-term, of course, the childcare, but also enabling parents in work poverty, support of families, and having a model education where parents are part of those helping the child. This is, yeah.